All right, fifth grade. This is our social studies lesson. This is lesson 1. All right. For this unit of study, we'll have a compelling question. So that is going to direct this unit of study. During every lesson, we will be asking what leads to change. So we'll be looking at quite a few different changes and how that change comes about, trying to answer the question, what leads to change? So that is our compelling question. Our supporting questions are, how have groups ensured their rights in the past? And how do groups' experiences compare to one another? And the third supporting question, how can a person support a grassroots campaign? Our learning target for today, I can explain how groups ensure their rights in the past. All right, so I want you to think about what types of groups you are involved in. It could be your family, it could be a church group, it could be a reading group, it could be a sports group, a library group, any groups that you have been in or are a part of now. Okay, so different groups have different rules. Sometimes different groups have different rights. So I want you to think about what rights that you have. Here at school, the fifth grade group came up with some rights that they have, and they are listed right here. Right to laws, right to ride your horse, right to vote, walk in public, right to walk your turtle, right to go to school, right to an education, right to be safe, right to clothing, right to working and teaching, right to life, right to freedom. And then we asked, how can you keep your rights? So if you have these rights, how do you make sure that you continue to have those rights? Okay, if you have any more rights that you do not see here that you have, I want you to email Ms. Harkin and let me know what they are. Right now, I want you to take your lap book and I want you to write those rights on the front of your lap book. If you need to, go ahead and pause this and then continue. Okay, you are going to read this one right here. This is the article, Women's Rights, Voting. This year is the 100th year that women have had the right to vote in the U.S. That is exciting. I'm going to go ahead and read it. I want you to follow along on yours. We're going to read it through once. If there's any, I want you to underline the important parts that we have. Okay, women's rights, voting. Women's rights have been up for debate for centuries. At different points in our past, women's rights have come and gone. Lawmakers, as well as everyday citizens, have fought and continue to fight for women's rights. One right women had to fight for was the right to vote, suffrage. Prior to 1920, women were allowed to vote in only a few select states. Through the work of individuals and organizations, women were able to finally convince lawmakers to pass and ratify an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The first Women's Right Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. Now, some of these, there was a typo, and so if yours says 1948, just take your pen or pencil and make the 9 into an 8, because Seneca Falls Convention was held in 1848. Started by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and later joined by Susan B. Anthony, the annual convention kept women's suffrage in the forefront of conversation for the public and lawmakers. In November 1872, Susan B. Anthony voted in the presidential election. She voted in an effort to test the U.S. Constitution and determine if the right to vote guaranteed in the 15th Amendment for all citizens applied to women. Anthony was arrested for voting. At her trial, she argued that as a citizen, she had a right to vote. The courts disagreed and found her guilty. Anthony was fined $100. She never paid the fine. Susan B. Anthony traveled to Washington, D.C. year after year to make a case for women's suffrage. In March 1913, the first women's suffrage procession was held. Sponsored by the American Women's Suffrage Association, it was organized by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. Dressed in white and carrying signs and place cards, thousands of women marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, past the White House to demonstrate their desire for suffrage. There were those on the sidelines that disagreed with women. Some observers yelled and called them names. Others threw items at the women. The crowd became violent, and eventually over 200 people needed to be treated at the hospital for injuries sustained from the violence. In June of 1916, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns started the National Women's Party. The party chose Washington, D.C. for its headquarters. The NWP, National Women's Party, took a more militant approach toward securing women's suffrage. Members of the NWP picketed outside of the White House. Known as the Silent Centennials, they picketed every day from January 10, 1917 until June 1919. So they picketed about a year and a half. They were outside every day in front of the White House for a year and a half. They felt that social and political pressure on the president was a smart avenue towards securing the vote. Despite being arrested, beaten, force-fed, and abused, the women continued to press their cause. The abuses the women endured was soon reported to the public. When the public heard how horribly the women were treated, it created a wave of sympathy for this group, whose only request was to simply vote. Public opinion shifted to supporting the women. In 1878, Congress introduced an amendment for women's suffrage. It failed several times. In 1919, the amendment finally passed. After that, it would take 36 states ratifying the new amendment for it to become part of the Constitution. In August of 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment, forever securing women's suffrage. Okay, so I want you to go ahead and think about what you noticed in the article and what you wonder about this article. What do you notice? What do you wonder? Go ahead and type that in the doc that's included with in the assignment. All right, and then I'm going to have you go ahead and watch this video here. It's called Ensuring Rights, Seneca Falls. And remember, ensuring is kind of the same as making sure. How do you make sure that you have those rights and you keep them?
The Seneca Falls Convention. The 1848 Seneca Falls Convention was the very first women's rights convention in the United States, kicking off a decades-long struggle for gender equality. Here, we'll tell the story of the Seneca Falls Convention and its lasting legacy, a story that started with a tea party. But we'll get into all that in just a minute. First, we have to understand the traditional 19th century gender roles. Men dominated the public sphere by working, voting, or participating in politics, while women stayed home to cook, clean, and raise children. There were restrictions in many states on women voting, owning property, and having control of their own income. One woman who advocated for women's rights in the 19th century was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a homemaker in Seneca Falls, New York. Born into a progressive family, Stanton grew up highly educated and enjoyed an active social and political life before settling down with a family. But Stanton felt stifled as just a wife and mother to 7 children, longing for a life outside the home. She soon found it in a local group of Quaker women who embraced equality, community, and activism. They invited her to a small social gathering, a tea party, which included a Quaker activist named Lucretia Mott. Mott and Stanton had met years before at an anti-slavery convention in London, but they were denied entry due to their gender. It was during the Tea Party that Stanton lamented the injustice of a woman's unequal status in society. Her words resonated with the others, so the women decided to hold a gathering that would call attention to the social, civil, and religious rights of women, the first of its kind in the United States. It became known as the Seneca Falls Convention, taking place on July 19th and 20th, 1848, with over 300 people in attendance. Like Stanton and Mott, many in attendance were also active in the anti-slavery movement, including Frederick Douglass, a former slave and abolitionist who was one of the few men and the only African American to attend. At the convention, they read the Declaration of Sentiments, a document drafted by Stanton and modeled after the Declaration of Independence, declaring, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." The sentiments outlined the civil and political rights denied to American women, which included education, property ownership, child custody in the event of a divorce, and most importantly, the right to vote. On the second day of the convention, 12 resolutions were passed and signed by 68 women and 32 men. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first time that American women demanded a change, and it caused quite a stir around the country. Many newspapers mocked them with unflattering political cartoons, while columns ridiculed the convention as dull and uninteresting or insane and ludicrous. One writer declared equal rights for women to be a monstrous injury to all mankind. The wave of negative press was too humiliating for some of the participants to handle, particularly those who had signed the Declaration of Sentiments. Several went as far as withdrawing their names from the document and joining the opposition. But public shaming didn't stop the movement. The impact and promise of the Seneca Falls Convention was undeniable. Women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton felt a renewed sense of purpose and threw themselves headlong into the fight for equal rights. A month later, a second, larger convention was held in Rochester, with the Declaration of Sentiments gaining 107 additional signatures. The Seneca Falls Convention would signal the birth of the women's rights movement. One particular resolution in the Declaration of Sentiments would evolve into a full-fledged crusade, the demand for women's suffrage. Decades of political organizing, marches, and protests would ultimately result in the 1920 passage of the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed women the right to vote, something that couldn't have happened without the Seneca Falls Convention.
All right. Your exit ticket. I want you to answer the question, how did women fight for and ensure their right to vote? All right, go ahead and make sure you have your exit ticket, the what you wrote down on the front of your lap book, the rights that you have, your notice and wonder, and that's it. All right, I'll see you next time.